Today's video is all about clay, and I'm going to show you step by step how to form a bird, but also how to make a hollow rattle or musical instrument. This lesson is inspired by Amico's Flock of Birds lesson, and this is something that I relied heavily on as a first-year teacher 12 years ago when I was young, teaching ceramics and just didn't know much about anything. I tried this lesson out with a group of 6th graders this school year, and they had so much fun, and as always, their creativity just blew me away. So I'm going to show you first how to make a pinch pot, how to score, slip, and blend it together, and I'm keeping mine just as simple as the tutorial online. I'm not adding any textures or carved details. Feel free to add wings, decorations, or carved designs to make your bird really have an impact, and you can make a multitude of animals using this technique. If you love learning about art, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an art tutorial. Whenever handed a fresh piece of clay, the first step is always to wedge. And wedging is where you take your hands and you're making sure that the clay is consistent and doesn't have any air pockets. Do not over wedge your clay. The more you touch it, your hands will pull the moisture from it. Wedge it for like 1 minute max so your clay stays fresh and easy to work with. Next, you will make a sphere or a 3-dimensional circle. I'm using a piece of canvas so I don't get all over my table, and I'm also going to use my hands to form my sphere. Now, when I do this in the classroom, students always love to smack the clay and make a really loud sound. That's not what's happening here. Yes, you're using your palm to work it into a sphere, but you're not like hitting your clay. Then you're going to give your clay a thumbs up and press down through your clay to create an opening. Do not go all the way through. Now for the pinch pot, supporting with one hand, you're going to pinch and turn, pinch and turn, pinch and turn. Notice I'm not pulling the clay open with both hands. I'm relying on just my right or dominant hand, and I'm supporting it with the other. In this scenario, you want to make sure that you're not going too thin. A little thicker is better at first. Okay? So unfortunately, you can't feel the way this feels, but just go around one more time, pressing gently to make sure the walls of your pinch pot are nice and even and you don't have any thin spots. I always like to tap it to create a nice rim, and your pinch pot does not need to be beautiful because we're going to form it into a bird or whatever animal that you would like. The next step is making clay beads, so this turns into a rattle, maraca, musical instrument, whatever you want to call it. A few important factors here. I always say you make 5 to 7 and vary the size and shape of them to create a unique sound. So if you put too many too close together, your rattle won't make music because the clay will all be clogged together. So when you put them in there, make sure there's plenty of room for them to dance around so that when you shake it, it actually makes a rattle sound. So with your beads, you want them to be about the size of your pinky nail with a little bit of variety, and you're going to form them and then cover them in toilet paper, tissues, or a paper towel, something thin, because if you don't, the clay is just going to sink to the bottom while you're working on it, and it will smush to the clay while it's still wet. To roll it up and put a tissue paper or toilet paper barrier between that and the wall of the clay, it's going to dry out, and the tissue paper is going to make sure it doesn't stick to the base of your pinch pot. Now, when this gets in the kiln and it's up at 1800 degrees, the tissue paper is just going to burn off. So the first time you shake it, you might see a little bit of like ash coming through the hole that you'll put in it. We'll talk about that hole later, and that's totally fine, normal, and safe because it's contained when you're firing the kiln. So, as you can see, I'm just placing them in there, making sure they're not too crowded. And this step is really important. And also, you won't know how your rattle sounds until you've already created it. So let loose, have fun, keep about 5 to 7 beads max. Next, we score, slip, and blend the edges of the pinch pot to itself to create the belly of your bird and the hollow form that will be your rattle. I'm using a shish kebab stick. That's something I love to use in the classroom because you get really fine detail and it just doesn't seem as dangerous as a needle tool. You can use a fork, but I feel like the fork has a softer line and I really enjoy being able to control how deep I go. So you have to put more marks using a shish kebab stick, but I feel like I have more control of how it goes. So score marks, you're opening up the clay so the slip can get in between the cracks and crevices. You're gonna fold it together, and slip is a combination of clay and water. Don't be scared. Yes, you're kind of squishing your bird shape, but as long as it stays hollow and you're careful, it will be fine. So this is slip I've made a few days ago. It's really a great consistency. I always say it's like painting with melted ice cream. And if you're new to making slip, if you take dried out clay and really hot water first and stir that together, that's the fastest way to make slip. I'm putting a layer of slip and I'm dabbing my paintbrush so the slip goes into the cracks and crevices without covering the score marks. Then I'm squishing it together and it makes me think of a clam or maybe an empanada because, you know, food references, that's my thing. And you're going to take a really small piece of clay to make a coil to bind the two pieces together. Now, a coil is a small piece of clay that basically you roll to make a snake shape out of. If you've never made coils before, check out the video above. It's a step-by-step coil building guide. But for this isn't structural. You're using the coil just as almost like a Band-Aid or stitches to connect your clay. So it doesn't have to be amazing. It just needs to be consistent. And for this, I would say smaller than your pinky nail, which normally I always recommend that it's never smaller than that. But again, this isn't for structural foundation. It's simply to blend that seam together so it's pretty and really well fused together. Anytime I attach pieces of clay together, I always score, slip, and smooth. That is the best way to guarantee that your clay pieces will dry consistently and really fuse together. So I'm putting score marks on my tiny little coil, and you can see why having control is so important with this small piece. Now, a score mark crosses over each other, so it's not just a line, it needs to look like a hashtag or a pound sign. And be careful, this is a small piece, so don't push down so hard that you destroy your coil. If you do, just roll another one, and then you're gonna set it on top and smush down into the slip. So when you score, slip, and blend, you put score marks on both surfaces, slip in the middle, and then you press together so that the pieces are fused together. Then the smoothing or blending is very important if you want it to be seamlessly connected. You can do this with your fingers or any variety of clay tools. That wooden tool you see on the right-hand side is a rib tool, and that's great for smoothing out large surfaces. You can see where the seam is actually connected. I feel like my hands are my best tool because, you know, I'm used to using them. And at this point, you're probably thinking, well, that is quite an ugly looking bird. And keep in mind that clay is kind of always ugly until you as the artist sculpt it into the form with the textures that you would like. This is really the fun part for me because now that you have your empanada shape, your clam shape, or your calzone shape, now it's time to start forming it into the shape of your animal. And again, I'm following the Amico step-by-step guide that I'm gonna put a link to in my description box. It is a great breakdown of what this video is all about. Again, I didn't come up with this technique. This was something I found as a young ceramics teacher, and I'm revisiting it with this video. So I'm using a variety of my hands, the rib tool, to smooth it out first. I feel like I need to get my thumbprints kind of smoothed out. Then once the texture is smooth, then I'll start worrying about the form of the bird. I'm gonna start with the head. And this is the tricky part because I don't want to create an air pocket by closing off my hollow form. I want it to be all kind of hollow. So I'm just using my hands to kind of pinch in where the neck of the bird would be, and I'm using my fingers to pull a beak without making it too pointy, because pointy things in clay and small pieces in clay tend to break and chip. So I know this isn't perfect. This is just getting started, and you can see I'm really focusing on smoothing out my texture. Now I'm doing kind of like a little bird tail. My poor bird feel like he had a lot to eat this year. He's got this kind of sad little tail. I will kind of work with that, but keep in mind, this is a very simplified version of the bird. So you could have open wings, you could carve in beautiful feathered details, and I'm just keeping mine very basic, and I'll rely on the glazing of my bird to kind of bring out those more decorative characteristics. So this is the part where I'm just going to obsessively smooth and shape until I feel like the bird is something that I would love to look up and see it like sitting in a tree outside my window. So I'm gonna speed things up a little bit because you watch me form the head just by gently squeezing the neck and pulling the beak. And I did the same technique with the tail feathers. So now I'm just gonna play around with sizes. How skinny do I want the neck? Do I want the tail to kind of like curve over to the side? And of course, smoothing out my texture obsessively. I think I use my hands for almost all of this, but feel free to experiment with the rib tool, a sponge, or anything that you have on hand. This will be by far the most time-consuming part of this work of art. Making a pinch pot and attaching it together takes very little time. I think my students get that done in the first 20 minutes of one class period. However, smoothing and forming the bird, that takes more thoughtful skill, and it's not something that someone can really show you how to do. I mean, you're watching me do it, so technically, yes, I'm showing you how I do it, but it's doing it by feel. You can't feel how my bird is. You can watch me kind of form it, but I would say just kind of get lost in the texture, just get lost in the material, and just trust yourself to form it into a shape that looks, bird-like. Now, I'm going to show you in a few minutes a couple other shapes that you could do for different animals. And your clay is more durable than you think. So you see me kind of grab the neck of my bird, and that's to get that nice head shape in there. You can't mess it up unless you, squeeze the life out of it, or you still want to ensure that the shape is hollow. So now I've let my clay sit in a bag overnight, and now the clay is starting to dry and stiffen and really hold its form. So all that work I did yesterday, now I'm going to paddle it using one of these larger blending tools. You can use a paddle if you have one, and this is changing the form of it with big planes instead of just your finger making the texture. So it's a very subtle difference. I'm hitting it gently, but enough to kind of change and shift the overall effect of the bird. This is also smoothing out some of those areas. Keep in mind it's hollow, so yeah, you're gonna hear a satisfying hollow sound in there. Try to not get carried away and hit it to the point where it crashes in on itself. Your bird did nothing to you, so be kind to it, but paddle it until you get the desired form. Now it's time for some finishing touches with my smoothing, and I'm going back to my hands because I feel like I can just really control. You can see how the clay kind of pulled away from the neck of the bird, going back with the rib tool too to really give it that defined neck head shape. I don't want it to look like a lumpy potato. I really want it to look bird-like. And I'm using slip from yesterday because the clay has hardened up enough that it acts as a smoothing surface on the top. So anytime my clay kind of needs a little extra moisture, I add a little bit of slip, not a ton because I don't want to break down the clay again with moisture. I'm using it as a way to smooth out certain areas. Doing the same on the tail feathers. Because it did dry out a little bit. Your clay, especially if you have really small beaks or a really small tail, the smaller pieces of clay that are out alone or farther away from the larger mass of clay always dries out quicker. So when you wrap clay, be very careful that those areas are wrapped. So dry time is very important with clay. You want it to be slow. The slower your clay can dry, the happier it will always be. So I'm just gonna obsessively work on smoothing this bird out using the variety of tools that you've seen me use before. And I am gonna get a sponge in there and give my bird a sponge bath. You want a surface on the bottom so that your bird can sit without rolling. That can be achieved by the rib tool, tapping it on the table, just so it doesn't roll over and fall to the floor and break once it's all said and done. I continued to do this obsessively for a long time. So I did edit and cut away some of me forming and smoothing the clay. Again, that's gonna be what you spend most of your time doing. So really enjoy it to get the clay to be the texture and the form that you want. You're the person, your hand is what creates that. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not magic. It's you putting the work in artwork. Once you're done obsessively smoothing, it's time to poke a hole to allow for air to pass through the hollow form of your instrument. If you don't poke an air hole, and usually I poke a couple because I just don't want it to explode, it will explode in the kiln. That is not just an art teacher trying to make art fun and dramatic. I had a student with this group make the most adorable little sheep. She shows sheep, and so that's what she created. And she finished it at home and brought it back in, and I forgot about the air hole, and so that poor thing, that sheep exploded everywhere in the kiln. And that's my bad. I should have double checked, but we will just add that to my very long list of teacher fails throughout the years. Now that you've seen the steps from start to finish, I'm going to show you some of the fun and creative ideas my students came up with. So here's a cute little hen that a student made. She's carving in a wing. Here, this one's amazing. She made a rat. Okay, so she's not finished yet, but you can see she added this tail. I love this one. Again, it's not done, but she is adding spider legs to it. And here are 3 of the finished products that have already been fired and glazed. Look how beautiful this one is. She scored, slip, and blended 2 wings on it. You can see the air holes there. And this is Jungle Gems glazes. They really turn out great for this project. This student did a very similar form, but you can see her wings are up, which I think is awesome. So you would just score, slip, and blend. Now, I have to say this one is my favorite. Cheyenne, you did amazing. She made a rat with a cute little bow, and y'all, that tail did not break, which is a miracle since I'm the one who put it in the kiln. And did you hear how lovely that rattle sounded? Super impressed with this one. The details really paid off. So here it is, the step-by-step guide of how to make a hollow bird out of clay that turns into a rattle. Think outside the box and try any animal that you feel comfortable with, or stick to the simple bird technique just like me. Don't forget to check out the Amico website that I link below that will take you through the step-by-step guide using a PDF. I did print these out and had my students look over them, so it was super helpful in the classroom. Thank you so much for sticking around and making art with me. Check out my website, thatartteacher.com, for full-length lesson plans, and find me on Instagram at thatartteacher_Machado.